Hello and welcome back to Watching Brief for the week of the 18th of October 2021. I am joined, as ever, by my London-based co-host, Mr. Andy Brockman. Good afternoon, Andy.
Good afternoon, Mark. I'm pleased to see that people in the provinces are paying due deference to the capital city.
It's a statement of fact, man. You're just in London. But if you want, I will doff my cap to as a poor provincial so and so to you down there in the royal city.
I'll accept that gesture with gratitude and point to the fact that you can always owe your allegiance really to the Prince Bishop in Durham, but also, in fact, we're going to level you all up anyway, so we're all going to be the same in the end. What the heck?
I'll believe that when I see it. When Prime Minister Johnson gets around to it.
You might say that I couldn't possibly comment.
Anyway,
an objective journalist.
Regardless of our geographical location, of our social economic position, or indeed of our cynicism, our watching brief continues, and that takes the form, as ever, of a discussion about the archaeological news of the week and the invitation for you guys to join the conversation in the comments below. And this week we have a fairly rich seam of an idea, and this idea is something that I've sort of titled, broadly speaking, in the notes for this week's agenda, treasure versus treasured. That is to say, the difference between the technical definition of treasure, i.e. metallic items with gold and silver content, that the coroner deems to be treasure, versus things which have cultural significance and that everyone else, in fact, can see is more or less in the same category as treasure, but is treated differently because of a technicality, actually, in terms of what it's made from. This sort of line of thinking has led us down the route of thinking about the relationship between museums, the public purse in terms of purchasing power, and the origin of so many artefacts that find their way into essentially a broader market of artifactual heritage that doesn't always begin with metal detecting. And the second half of this week's show is definitely a case study in something which is not from that sort of origin. But in this instance, did start out in a field and was discovered by two metal detectorists. And it all really kicks off with the York Museums Trust press release, the announcement that rare Roman bronzes have been acquired by the Yorkshire Museum. This was dated the 13th of October, and they go on to say that 1,800-year-old hoard, including a bust of Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, has been secured thanks to the generous support of various donors, including Richard Bellison, other individual donors, the Art Fund, and David Aaron, ALTD, a London-based antiques trader. I mean, what's wrong with this, actually, Andy? I mean, why are we commenting on this? This is a museum that's bought something for the public to be able to view, seemingly in perpetuity from now on.
And that's to be welcomed, and it is all perfectly legal. But I think it raises some interesting questions. A bit of background for our viewer. In May of 2020, two metal detectorists, James Spark and Marc Didlick, were metal detecting in a field near Ampleforth. People might remember Ampleforth Abbey is a very famous monastery in rural Yorkshire, North Yorkshire, in an area called Ryedale. And they found and they found a hoard of large Roman bronze objects. In particular, there's a horseman. There's the head and front legs of a leaping horse. There is a bust, which is tentatively identified by a number of experts as of being the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. It certainly appears to be a 2nd century Antonine period head. It's bearded. He's got curly hair. He's not carrying a copy of the Meditations because he hasn't got any hands because it's a bust, but it looks like the head of an emperor of that period.
To be fair, though, he does look like a promontory against which the waves of the world might crash, to quote to quote Meditations there. He is
Absolutely.
unmoved by the world. And also that,
Absolutely, but something else that would help the assess whether the world was being moved or not is the rather incongruous object that completes the hoard, which is a plumb bob.
yeah, yeah, and a plumb bob for folks at home, if in case you don't know, is just a weight. Often it's a weight that's shaped to have a point at the bottom for indication purposes. You hang it from a string, and it gives you a true, due to gravity, a true line in terms of straight down. You can use it for masonry. You can use it for
And in
sculpture.
fact, and in fact, it was an integral part of a Roman engineering measuring instrument called a groma.
Yes.
Which used plumb bobs to create right angles and set off straight lines on building sites and so on. So it's something that was integral to Roman civilization, if you like, Roman architecture, Roman building. The objects were found, and my understanding from talking to people who are familiar with the process is that there were initial negotiations between the finders and the landowner and the York Museums Trust to take on the objects, because they were very rapidly seen as being of national importance and obviously very, great importance to the cultural history of Roman Yorkshire. And they were able to have those kind of negotiations because, being a base metal copper alloy, bronze, they don't come under the purview of the Treasure Act 1996. So it wasn't compulsory for the finders to report them to the coroner and for there to be an investigatory process and an inquest to assess value and assign them to be kept by the public, which is the case with treasure objects which contain gold or silver.
So was initial conversation begun though with the museum regardless?
That is my understanding.
Right.
Now, again, this is from one source, but it's a source who's familiar with the process.
Yeah.
Now, at some point, those negotiations were ended. And it was decided that the objects would go to auction at a Derbyshire-based auctioneer called Hanson's, which we talked about before on Watching Brief. It's famously headed up by Charlie Hanson, who's a BBC TV personality.
Yeah, a darling of bargain hunters. Yeah,
that's right. He's a regular on daytime TV. He's got this sort of cheeky chappy persona, which is a very sharp businessman. And basically, Hansons have made something of a speciality in selling metal detected items. And in this case, the objects went to auction and were sold to a London-based dealer called David Aaron for £185,000.
Yes.
Now,
well, I was going to say, what's interesting here is this comes in the context, as you say, of this same auction house being very good at positioning, especially ancient and even prehistoric metal items to be sold for very high prices. I think recently or last year or something, COVID timeline, so I sort of lose track of when we talk about things sometimes. We discussed an Iron Age series of metal items linked with equine sort of horse art and horse riding, which technically was being sold in a very above board way, but it's the positioning, it's taking this stuff out of the conversations with the museum and putting it into a sort of a public realm where advertising in particular becomes key. It's the conversation that surrounds the artifact that then positions it to be bought at a certain price, I think. And Hanson seems to be particularly good at manufacturing that interest.
That's right, and I'll read you just quickly. This is the way that Hanson's presented it in their auction catalogue. This is the brief description. There's a much longer description, which ties in with lots of gives academic references and so on and so on and so on. But this is how they pitched it to the punters who were just looking at the first paragraph. The Ryedale Ritual Bronzes, a unique assemblage of Roman ritual artefacts from Yorkshire. In May 2020, approximately 20 miles north of York, the Roman city of Everarkham, two friends, Marc and James Spark, unearthed an amazing assemblage of Roman bronze work, consisting of a large bust, a horse and rider figurine, a zoomorphic knife handle, and a pendulum. This assemblage almost certainly represents a set of ritual equipment buried as one deposit in the closing decades of the 2nd century. And the estimate it gives was £70,000 to £90,000.
Yes.
Now, as you can see, that is less than half of what it eventually sold for. The lower end of the estimate is less than half of what it eventually sold for.
Yes. Yeah.
And that is that kind of those kind of estimates are classic "come on and buy me" estimates from auctioneers who wanted to drive the price. Same thing happened with the piece of Iron Age equipment, horse equipment that you mentioned just now.
I would invite people to take a look at this text, actually, because it's written in a way that to my dyslexic eye is very unfriendly, but also actually to I think to anyone who's accustomed to reading, for example, academic texts or papers, it's a block of text. It's not really paragraphed properly. It's barely spaced in a way that's very user friendly, but it is absolutely packed with references to Wikipedia. There's a JSTOR article there. There's a Portable Antiquities Scheme link chucked in there. And there are actually a couple of those links, in fact. They're using the work of archaeologists and others, not so much to talk about the cultural context and the body of research that goes into the understanding of an artifact necessarily, but rather to establish value. There's also actually a British Museum link in there as well. Actually, I just spotted. This is the use of I suppose historiosity as a adding to intrinsic worth of these bronze artifacts. It's again, it's not illegal, but it is very much a redeployment of archaeological and historical facts and research and fact finding to increase the price of artifacts. Now, what that then means is that presumably in a museum, if you want, we can go hypothetical at this point, Andy, a museum who may have started a conversation where they were going to buy something for a certain price that may be, I don't know, maybe 1/18 of what eventually was the sale price of an artifact, 20% or something, is actually forced to now be buying these things at what is deemed to be market level and market rates. Now, this there's a slight rabbit aside here, in so much as I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago with someone who commented on a Watching Brief video, who asked what I thought of the truth, the fact that apparently the British Museum buys at low levels and sells artifacts on at profit. Of course, this person couldn't provide any proof for their assertions, but it's interesting that this is what's in the bloodstream. Once the artifact is moved into this sort of marketplace, it's all about value, it's all about apparent market rates, however the market is in fact being established. And this market is not only sucking more money than has to be sucked out of the public purse, it's also, if we look at the art newspaper link that we've included below, a market that is crammed potentially with people who are also selling fakes. New York dealer arrested for selling cookie-cutter manufactured goods as authentic antiques. This is actually a story from a couple of weeks ago. But recently came to the attention of the Times and the New York Times last week. So I'm linking. This was actually published in the art newspaper on the 26th of August. But people may have seen this last week in the Times, for example. So is that what we're examining here? And I suppose implicitly objecting to is the slightly cynical maneuvering of artifacts into a position where I guess you and I, as taxpayers, are having to pay more than we otherwise might do in the context of museums purchasing artifacts. Not necessarily directly in the case of the Ryedale Hoard, I have to say.
Look, this is a devil's bargain that was made a long time ago. Property law in the UK is such that objects like this, if these are come up on an archaeological site, there are agreements before a space put in the ground about fines and where fines are going to go and where they're going to be deposited. And if these are turned up on an archaeological site, like, for example, Petuaria, where we were working in July on a Roman site of exactly this period, then there would have been no question that those objects would have ended up in, this belongs in a museum. And that they
So
were,
do you. Sorry.
Yes, exactly. It's the fact that they were found on private land by private individuals, and with the agreement of the landowner, the negotiations went forward because they weren't covered by the Treasure Act. Everything that happened was perfectly legal. Hanson's will say that it's perfectly legitimate for them to promote objects and to price them competitively, and so on and so on and so on. But the overall effect of this is, you're quite right. It drives the market. Any metal detectorist seeing this will see more pound signs in front of their eyes by going to auction than maybe, for example, coming to a private arrangement with the local museum. Or even donating to the local museum, which is many ethical metal detectorists do. If a museum is still in a position to actually accession material these days, which not all of them are.
And incidentally, I should say that of course, there's no evidence that the British Museum sells its collection, because legally it's not allowed to. This is a rumour that is spread around for precisely those reasons. People,
there's also a misunderstanding among many metal detectorists that because the Treasure Committee, which assesses treasure finds and assesses value to treasure finds, actually sits at the British Museum, meets at the British Museum, and uses British Museum experts, that it's somehow British Museum structure. It's not. It's separate. It's set up to administer the Treasure Act, which is something very different.
Of course they'd say that. It's all a conspiracy. But anyway, the point is, though, this is a system, British Museum aside, but even the British Museum as well, actually. But this is a system which does not have all the money in the world. There's an article here from inyourarea.co.uk, oddly enough, where owners are being urged to claim back heritage centre items. A deadline has been set before unclaimed items will be taken away at Ashbourne's Heritage Centre. Apparently, the Tuesday, the 30th of November, is the deadline by which items stored in the Heritage Centre are to be collected before the Town Council washes their hands of everything therein. Dozens of items were kept securely in the Church Street building, which was run by the late historian Trilby Shaw, and they are now in a state of limbo while volunteers scramble to catalogue them and work out who owns what. This is the system that's being gamed, that's having this sort of these sorts of prices forced upon it, and it's not great. It's also not great because that refrain, it's perfectly legal. It's fine. It's perfectly legal. It's legal. It's legal where I operate, or whatever, however people want to try and justify themselves. It's something that we also come to in our second focus for this week's Watching Brief, and that is the sale of human remains, the sale of, in this instance, bones online. Interestingly, the ABC News article that we highlighted, or we chose to highlight this story, we'll try and find another link below, but we'll also link to this one as well out of interest. At the moment, has the story listed as "Oops, page unavailable." Whether that's because of the nature of the article or not, who can say at this stage? But we started looking into this, and we were led to the recommendation for today's interview, weren't we, Andy?
That's right. We wanted to cover the issue of the sale of human remains, which has far fewer regulations around it than many people might expect. And particularly given the current focus on decolonisation and the treatment of indigenous archaeology in the past, and the, shall we say, the sometimes less than legitimate ways of obtaining indigenous artifacts that were exercised by museums in the past. We wanted to look at this, and we started doing some research, and we were led to two things. We were led to a New York-based website, and we were also led to the TikTok account of Stephanie Black, who is an Australian archaeologist who's currently studying in the UK, but has used her TikTok account to highlight the issues of human remains and the treatment of human remains and the sale of human remains. And we invited Stephanie to join us, and this is the interview we recorded earlier. Our guest on this week's Watching Brief is Stephanie Black, who trained in Australia at Macquarie University as an archaeologist and is now at Durham University in the UK studying for an MA. But you might know her better as Steph the Archaeologist on TikTok, and in particular through some work she's been doing recently, some videos she's been publishing recently about an American human osteology dealer, for want of a better description, a company called John's Bones, which has raised some wider issues about the ethics of presenting and handling human remains that Stephanie's been highlighting. Stephanie, welcome to Watching Brief. How did you first discover the John's Bones store, and what made you want to respond to it in your TikTok videos?
Basically, he was one of the first accounts I saw, and I had originally followed him. And then, you know, when you just get weird vibes from someone, because his whole thing is that he has this huge wall of spines, a human spine. So he's known on TikTok as the spines guy. And then I had a follower just like send me a message and go, hey, I've just caught like really weird vibes from this guy. Could you just do like a video? And so I just started doing some research on him, and I thought, it would just be like a generic kind of, he does seem to know his law. Technically what he's doing is legal. And then I found the Sami skull, and I was like, that isn't good. And then you kind of dig deeper into his business, and there were just a lot of red flags with how the whole thing was being run.
Let's start with the legality issue, because that's the first thing that dealers like him will probably say, is that certainly in New York, where he's based, he appears not to be breaking any state laws. And in the UK, for example, the owning and sale of historic human remains isn't covered by licensing. We do have the Human Tissue Authority, which exerts a certain amount of regulation, but it's pretty loose, and educational use is one of the exemptions, I think, if I'm correct in saying. So what is the reason for highlighting something which is essentially a legal trade?
It's because it's something that isn't morally right. Like, there's a lot of justification on his account. Like, if people raise questions and go, hey, this seems a little odd, he's like, but it's legal. And I don't know, if you have to work so hard to justify that your work is legal when so many people are like going, there's something not quite right there, really.
Do you think that in this area, the sort of ethical view of archaeologists is running ahead perhaps of the public and the wider media? Certainly I've been aware of, in the time that I've been working in archaeology, the sensitivity around human remains has become much more pronounced. It's much more part of our training and our daily working lives, if you like, and particularly when it comes to the remains of ethnic peoples.
Yeah. Definitely, like all the sites I've worked on, like even before you go out to start digging, you always have like a big conversation around the ethics. So like if you are excavating human remains, like not taking photos, not publishing them online, not even giving people or the skeleton a name or anything, like being very, very conscious that this is a person, that this is, this was someone who lived, and so we should afford them respect. Yeah, which doesn't really seem to be something that John is doing necessarily.
Obviously, he's not here to answer for himself, although he's not backward in coming forward himself on social media. Obviously, we're deliberately not linking to his site, although he's very easily findable by Google. Other search engines are available. So if any of our viewers do want to go and look at what he's doing, it's perfectly open to do so. What he does say is that as well as being legal, he operates ethically, that there are checks and balances. He says explicitly on his website, and if I just pull it up here to quote, in the sales section of his website, he says that his products are responsibly sourced, that we do not purchase or accept osteology that's been acquired in irresponsible or illegal manners. After completing the form, offering something to the company. All items will be assessed by a Johns Bones representative, and an offer will be issued. So he's claiming that the work doesn't, there are legal checks and balances throughout, that it's assessed expertly. Are you convinced by that?
I think he thinks he's doing the right thing. But when I was looking at the staff members, he is still, I believe, still studying at Parsons School of Design in New York. You know, he's 21, he's quite young. And I was like, oh, you know, are there more like professionals behind him? And the only person with any osteological experience was an individual who didn't have a last name nor a photo on his account, and who just had their BA, which to me, if you're running a business like this, you need more than that. And it also said in their bio that they assess the bones by photos. And anyone who said any dealing with bones, no, you can't. I mean, it's difficult enough to assess bones, let alone doing it only through photographs.
Okay, so moving forward, you mentioned a particular issue, and one of the things that attracted you to caught your attention was the issue of a Sami skull. Now, I understand from the background we did on this before we started recording this segment that there are questions over whether that actually was in the possession of Johns Bones legally. How it came to be in the United States was somewhat opaque.
Yeah, it's honestly, it's not altogether clear, because he did take the skull down from his website. Like when I made my first video, I was like, oh, I should maybe like take a photo of this. So I do have a photo sitting on my phone that I have given to some Sami people who have asked for it, so they can pass it on to their own representatives to see how this came about. Because I know in the US, it is like, the sale of bones in most places in the US is legal. It's just Indigenous remains. But as the Sami aren't a North American Indigenous group, they aren't protected. They don't have those sort of same protections.
Right. Now, extending the discussion really to Indigenous peoples, and I'm asking you really as an archaeologist trained in Australia, do you think, as we said at the beginning, you trained at Macquarie, do you think that training in an area where Indigenous archaeology is very much a part of practice and everyday practice for people going off to work in the sector, do you think you get a better grounding in the practicalities and ethics of this kind of work than maybe in the UK, where we don't have the same day-to-day sensitivities? Broadly speaking, I mean, there have been cases in the UK, for example, of Jewish sites, where obviously, again, the treatment of human remains is very much tied in with cultural practice.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it was part of my degree. Like, you're very sort of conscious, and kind of we were told, yeah, if you do work on like a site in Australia and you come across like Indigenous or suspected Indigenous human remains, like you basically don't touch them. Like maybe even the site can get shut down until people can check it. It is a very hot topic as well, Indigenous remains. There's a lot of factors, not only archaeological, but like political, and the whole history of Australia and the treatment of Indigenous peoples that also impact how that goes about.
And I would say actually in the UK, certainly there have been cases in recent years when UK museums have returned human remains, in particular to Indigenous peoples in Australia, the Pacific, and I think also in North America. As we sort of come to an end of this segment, in the UK, certainly, there was a case, for example, in 2019 of an auction house which appeared to be about to offer Saxon human remains, early medieval human remains that came from a private collection. So there was a lot of pushback in the archaeological sector from that, and the skull, which had been nicknamed and apparently gendered by the auction house Charlie, was very clearly, withdrawn from sale. That was a sort of a one-off, and it was almost like a sort of firefighting response. Do you think the archaeology sector needs to come up with a more coherent and perhaps a more detailed and proactive strategy in this area?
I think people are obviously aware of it, and I do think archaeologists are kind of conscious of it, but I feel like maybe there could be more done because there are private collectors out there. I mean, I've found more of like some from the UK who are on TikTok. And, you know, it's like one of those things that, yes, technically it is legal, but I do think archaeologists can talk about it and go, hey, like considering the history of archaeology and how in essence we've had that promotion of human remains and the kind of whole history we have, it's now our job to sort of respond and go, actually, isn't the right thing to be doing. Just because it's legal doesn't mean it's ethical.
Absolutely. Now, and just to finish, you've mentioned there that there are collectors active on TikTok, which is obviously one of the newer social media platforms. You're very active on TikTok, and as I said, we'll link to your account so that people can watch your videos on this area and hopefully follow you going forward. But do you think that the fact that a lot of this kind of thing happens on sales platforms, on social media platforms that aren't the traditional archaeological media, aren't the traditional archaeological journals of record and so on, do you think that is why maybe these things slip under the radar and aren't given maybe the amount of coverage and thought that they perhaps warrant?
I think it's like such a big issue. Like obviously, like the instance I'm organized, like it's one social media, it's kind of one user. I mean, there's already more people on there, and like TikTok is such a new social media. Like I'm sure it's way more established on places like Twitter and Facebook, and it's so big. Not one person, and I don't think not one group can fully deal with it because it is so complex and it is everywhere and it is very hard to police, I think.
One final question. It's the sort of monarch for a day question. If you were suddenly in charge of the CB, Council of British Archaeology, or the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists, one of the main archaeological bodies in the country for the day, and you were told that you could do one thing in this area to bring to bring that ethical view, that ethical stance and in-depth thought to the area of human remains, what would you do?
Oh, that's a tough question. I think I would start doing something to look at the legality of it, because I think if you start pushing into, is this legal, especially with the murky history and the origin of a lot of these remains, because like John says that, well, I get them from, doctors' offices, people have just had them sitting in their attics. It's like, okay, but where did those people get them from? And so I think if you really consider the legality and study that, I think that would be really good.
I think that's a nice, nutty, complex thought to end on. Stephanie Black, thank you very much for joining the Watching Brief.
Thank you.
So, John's Bones. It's unfortunate, really, that's the name of his business, because I also know an archaeologist called Bones Jones, who's a perfectly lovely, if slightly eccentric man who used to work at, or possibly still works at, the Archaeological Trust. But aside from the name, what's your takeaway from this sort of offshoot of this commodification of the artifactual past that we've been discussing? Obviously these aren't metal remains, this isn't treasure per se, but it is a key part of our physical heritage.
Yeah, look, I think a few sort of short takeaways from it, apart from the fact that a commercial auction house, Hanson's, has had a walk-on part in both our stories. In fact, more than a walk-on part in our first story.
Yeah.
And through doing nothing other than its legitimate commercial business, which is perfectly legal.
And also, it should be said, its business is also to increase the value of the things it wants to sell.
Exactly.
It's there to generate interest. I get that. I do understand
exactly.
that.
Its function is to sell stuff to the public that the public is willing to pay for, and to make as much money in the process as it can.
Yes.
That's how capitalism works. It's absolutely fine and legal in the UK as we sit here in 2021. But aside from that, I think first of all, a lot of the sale and presentation of this material for sale is happening on electronic platforms, digital platforms. It's happening outside of the purview of journals of record and things like that. And we picked up on the story and on Stephanie's work from TikTok, which is one of the newest social media platforms. And I think it just shows how quickly things like this can appear, can be examined, can move on, and possibly without actually the great and the good in the archaeological and heritage sector even being aware of them in many cases. It's only through platforms like this and other people who work in social media who then try and transfer the knowledge into the sector, into the wider sector, that these things are on the radar at all.
Well,
and the final thing,
and in that sense, sorry, it's also a market that's not actually happening on a market site. It's not. This isn't happening on. No. It does happen on eBay, but in this instance, this case study is not, for example, in a that sort of market. It's actually it's a very similar to Hanson's. Actually, it's a publicization of things that are available that then lead to people's interest in purchasing them. So yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, it regardless of the ethical side of it, legally, it's quite legitimate. And I think looking at both aspects of it, then perhaps the wider heritage world, the wider archaeological world, needs to take cognizance of what's going on, be aware, or have be made aware of what's going on platforms like TikTok, like eBay, and other sales platforms, and come up with a joined up response that if something's not ethical, then as a sector we say it's not ethical and campaign against it. I mean, when we were preparing this, I had a look at the British Association for Biological Anthropology, which is an expert group that looks at areas around this, and it has a clear stance that it sees the trading of human remains for commercial gain unacceptable. So that there's a clear ethical position. It's also worth saying that certainly as far as the UK is concerned, if human remains are less than 100 years old, then they come under the Human Tissue Act 2004, which means that unless a license has been obtained, public display certainly is not allowed. They also point out that many of the human remains that are on the market and are used in medical schools and things like that, and possibly, obviously there's no chain of evidence here, but the kind of thing that might turn up at a company like John's Bones come from the Far East. There was a trade in human remains from the Far East into Western medical schools, for example, in the 20th century. And relatively recently, both China and India have banned the export of human remains. India in 1985, China as recently as 2008.
Right.
So, it may well be that something that's on sale in John's Bones legally in New York may not be legal to certainly display in the UK. Historic material older than 100 years, it's a different matter.
No, but it's it's definitely in that very dodgy legal area that
exactly.
That the refrain, it's all perfectly legal, simply doesn't quite bat away.
It's all perfectly legal if
yeah. Well, and it's interesting to me that, I mean, you mentioned journals of record, you mentioned the fact that in that sense, these conversations, these sales, this interest is being drummed up surrounding a business based in New York is happening well outside the purview of most academics in particular, for example. But also as well, it's a conversation that that is happening despite the fact that for many years now, for a long time, for as long as I've been aware of it, museums studies in particular have been discussing and debating the use of human remains. Do we really need to have that person's body or their skeleton on display in order to talk about them, for example? Could we use drawings, photography, 3D printing, so on and so forth? These are conversations that are happening within the sector. But it's interesting to me how not only are those conversations seemingly not permeating into, for example, the sale of that sort of market, regardless of who's doing the purchasing, but also as well, it's the reaction that we see in comments on these stories and on this sort of news, where, excuse me, people sort of say, well, they've been dead for ages. It doesn't really matter. They don't know they're dead. These remains are really old, or whatever. And indeed, on for example, John Bones's website, he indicates that he expects people to just have bones in the attic. Oh, do you happen to have some bones lying around? I'll buy them from you. But as quickly comes to mind, if you think about it for more than a few minutes, and you actually think outside your personal embodied existence, those bones came from someone else. They were inside someone else. They were another person. Those bones weren't always donated, for example. In the case of, say, here in the UK, some medical schools, infamously in Edinburgh, were purchasing, people who've been executed or people who were being maybe buried and not buried, so on and so forth. So the trafficking of human remains is not new. But therefore, there's an awful lot of bones floating around, stuff that may be in old medical collections, stuff that may be in people's personal collections that have questionable origin,
or not so old. You're quite right to raise those issues, and I'll finish with just sort of one observation, which is slightly personal, anecdotal, but also I think is illustrative. First of all, in terms of provenance, that Saxon material that was sold by Hanson's, the early medieval material that was sold by Hanson's, including the skull, which was eventually withdrawn from sale, if it ever was on sale, it's slightly ambiguous as to what was going on, will link to a blog piece by Howard Williams, who's a specialist in this area, which explores the background to Hanson's sale. But that material was derived from an excavation by a school teacher who was an amateur archaeologist of a Saxon cemetery in the 1960s, and the material was being disposed of by his wife after he died. So that is the route by which that material came into the commercial market. And the other thing I would say, and again, this is very personal and anecdotal, and it's why I'm torn about the whole subject, and I'm having a constant debate with myself whenever we talk about things like this, whenever my work brings me into contact or with things like human remains. And that is at one level, particularly as an archaeologist who works in the archaeology of modern conflict, and I've dug on the Western Front, and the protocols there, for example, the British Ministry of Defence and the Joint Casualty and Compassionate Centre, which oversees the recovery of British and Commonwealth war dead, does not allow the taking of photography, sharing of images without express permission, and in most cases that's not given. And they say that's down to a privacy and respect issue, particularly because next of kin may well be involved. When we're trying to identify somebody who's recovered, for example, on the Western Front or from an aircraft that crashed in World War II. So it is absolutely not allowed. It has the same level of respect and stricture as around certain areas of indigenous archaeology in, say, Australia.
Well, it's dignity.
At the same time, one of the reasons it is dignity, absolutely. It's about dignity, it's about respect. At the same time, one of the reasons, in fact, my first archaeological memory is a primary school visit to the British Museum and the mummy room and the desiccated display of the body of the pre-dynastic Egyptian person who is nicknamed Ginger.
Right.
It's an incredibly powerful image. It stayed with me for now something like 50 years since I made that first visit. And because it's about people, and Sir Mortimer Wheeler famously said, archaeology is digging up people. And this is about as intimate with the people as we get. And so it's absolutely tied up with our archaeology. I just think it's a constant debate about how we handle that relationship with those people who were people like us with respect.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I can understand that. And in that sense, human remains are dramatic by definition. They can be powerful, they can be instructive. And I suppose a key question is, do they always have to be on display? And indeed, in this context, should they be on sale? Indeed, should any of the heritage that we've been talking about be subject to the sort of crass marketeering that we have been discussing today? So
exactly. Does cultural value equate to commercial value? And I would argue it never does. Cultural value is always more important.
Yeah, although apparently it doesn't stop some people from using cultural value to up the price of something.
It's complicated.
It is complicated, but I mean, this has been an interesting watching brief for the week. Hopefully, I mean, by definition, this conversation is going to continue in some capacity at some point. Hopefully, this hasn't been too confusing or distressing in some cases for you in terms of thinking about this, you guys at home. This is something that I think sometimes archaeologists can sometimes forget. Dealing with bodies is something that we do and that we think about a lot. But this is something that's also worthwhile thinking about: how we value, whether we treasure all things that should be treasured or not. Thank you guys for watching. Thank you for your time, Andy, as ever this week. And until next time, guys, do take care. Bye-bye.